From slurping squirrel soup, to eating marshmallow-covered sweet potatoes, to getting 3.5 tons of jelly beans delivered to the White House. This is every US president's favorite food. And some of these are so crazy, you'll be wondering how they even survived. Like George Washington, who started his mornings one way and one way only, eating hoe cakes. No, come on guys, it's not a bad word. Hoe cakes were just cornmeal pancakes. At Mount Vernon, his step-granddaughter said he downed 3 little cakes every morning, each one swimming in butter and honey. But they weren't just sweet, they were practical. 'Cause Washington's teeth were in such terrible shape, he soaked the pancakes until they were soft enough to slip down without a fight. But our next president kept things a little more simple, because John Adams was a cider guy. Like most New Englanders at the time, Adams drank a tankard of hard cider with breakfast every day. But he didn't stop there, because Adams' favorite dessert was apple pan dowdy, a baked apple pudding rich with molasses and spice. So between the cider in the morning and apple pudding at night, Adams wasn't just America's second president. He was America's first full-time Apple influencer. But while Adams was powered by apples, this next guy was powered by mac and cheese. 'Cause while working as America's minister in France, Thomas Jefferson fell in love with macaroni and Parmesan cheese. And he brought the obsession home with him, along with an actual pasta machine. In 1802, Jefferson shocked White House guests when he served up a baked macaroni pie, basically the OG mac and cheese gratin. Minds were blown. And Jefferson also scribbled down detailed recipes for a creamy macaroni pudding. The man was basically America's first food blogger, except with a quill. Meanwhile, James Madison kept things pretty private, so we don't really know his favorite food. But we do know that his wife Dolly was responsible for turning ice cream into a national sensation, 'cause she served it at White House parties in flavors like strawberry, apricot, and oyster. Delicious. Well, actually the oyster flavor turned out to be a myth. But the Madisons even had an ice house built just to keep the supply flowing. It even got to the point where rivals joked that Madison cared more about Dolly's desserts than the nation's business. And honestly, if you had endless ice cream in the 1810s, you might too. On the other hand, James Monroe's go-to comfort food was spoon bread. Think cornbread meets souffle, a soft custardy casserole you could scoop with, well, a spoon. 'Cause at his Oak Hill plantation in Virginia, it showed up at the table all the time, usually alongside fried chicken or ham. It was basically Monroe on a plate, Virginia corn with European finesse. It tastes pretty good. Will this make me president one day? But unlike Monroe, John Quincy Adams was happier with fresh fruit. Apples, pears, plums, if it grew on a tree, he was eating it. He even expanded the White House grounds with gardens and fruit trees. So while visitors showed up expecting a grand feast, surprise, they get a plate of fruit instead. But you know the saying, you are what you eat? Well, Andrew Jackson took that literally, 'cause his favorite dish had a name as tough as he was, leather britches, which were basically green beans simmered slowly with bacon, salty, smoky, and chewy. Jackson's pure frontier fuel. And sure, he ate hickory nut soup and fried apple pies too. But nothing fit the man better than a plate of leather britches. Now, compare that with Martin Van Buren, who preferred seafood, more specifically, oysters. Raw, baked, stewed in soups, it didn't matter. If there were oysters on the table, he was happy. 'Cause growing up in New York, oysters were everywhere and dirt cheap. So when he entered the White House, he often ignored pastries, cakes, and apples and made a beeline for the oysters. He even joked that the success of a dinner could be measured by the mountain of shells left under the table. Sir, my feet are starting to smell fishy. But while Van Buren ate oysters, William Henry Harrison slurped squirrel stew, a classic frontier staple. And yeah, tastes exactly how it sounds. A little nutty. But during his 1840 campaign, rallies handed out free squirrel stew with cornbread and cider, feeding both bellies and votes. The message was clear. Harrison wasn't some polished aristocrat. He was the log cabin guy, eating the same stew as the frontiersmen who backed him.
What's going on?
But next up, John Tyler had a soft spot for Indian pudding, a baked mix of cornmeal, molasses, and milk, spiced and slow-cooked until warm and comforting. Yum, that looks pretty good. And with 15 children, it was also practical, cause you can make a massive batch and keep everyone fed. Eat up, kids! On the other hand, James K. Polk was a cornbread man through and through. Raised in the South, Polk wasn't interested in elaborate banquets. Give him cornbread, hoe cakes, or ash cakes baked right in the ashes, and he was satisfied. A simple man of simple taste. Kinda like Zachary Taylor, who had a die-hard love for challah, Creole rice fritters from Louisiana, because Taylor spent most of his military career around New Orleans, where he got addicted to the local street food. The fritters were fried up fresh by vendors in the French Quarter, usually eaten hot in the morning with a strong cup of coffee. And Taylor never forgot them, because he brought challah straight into the White House. But Millard Fillmore was the total opposite, because he enjoyed soup, especially mock turtle soup. Except it wasn't made with turtle at all, but with calf's head. Ew! It was designed to imitate the expensive green turtle soups popular in Victorian high society. Odd? Definitely. But back then, it was a delicacy. And Fillmore liked it so much, he even had the first stove installed in the White House kitchen to make soup prep easier. And hey, mock turtle soup I can handle. But if I see mock eagle soup on the menu, that's when I'm flying straight into witness protection, where hopefully I end up with Franklin Pierce, who hailed from New England and loved fried clams. Something I could seriously get behind. Crispy, golden, and straight from the seashore. Now pair that with clam chowder, and Franklin Pierce was in heaven. But I wish I could say the same for this next president, because James Buchanan, the only US president who never married, had one true love: cabbage. Sauerkraut, coleslaw, buttered cabbage, you name it, Buchanan piled it on his plate. And personally, not my thing. Which is why I'd much rather move on to the next guy, Abraham Lincoln, a man who loved his bacon. From his frontier childhood to riding the legal circuit to long nights in the White House, bacon was always close by. Even during the Civil War, Lincoln joined soldiers around the campfire, sharing bacon and hardtack. And that moment stuck, because nothing said man of the people quite like a president eating rations shoulder to shoulder with his troops. The power of bacon. Something I bet Andrew Johnson could have used, because as he stumbled through his presidency, Johnson leaned on Hoppin' John, black-eyed peas and rice simmered with pork. It was a Southern staple, eaten on New Year's for luck and prosperity, two things Johnson was always short on. However, after surviving impeachment by just one vote, he must have had a big helping of Hoppin' John on his plate. Give me some of that. But unlike Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant didn't need food for good luck. He needed it for fuel, because Grant had a sweet spot for rice pudding. After years of war, his stomach was left in rough shape from a poor army diet, alcohol, and stress. So instead of opting for rich, fancy food, Grant kept it simple. Even while guests dined on elaborate French cuisine, Grant would head straight for the pudding bowl made by his wife Julia. Would you look at that? The hero of Appomattox turning down French delicacies for homemade dessert. It just doesn't get more Grant than that. Kinda like Rutherford B. Hayes, who also turned down fine dining, but instead for cornmeal pancakes. Because Sunday mornings at the Hayes household usually started with a stack of flapjacks dripping with molasses. Even during the Civil War, Hayes wrote home about how much he missed them. And when he became president, he didn't swap them out for French crepes to impress visiting dignitaries. He served cornmeal pancakes, because to Hayes, that was the true taste of America's frontier. But speaking of frontiers, James Garfield grew up on the Ohio frontier, and his favorite food was squirrel soup, just like William Henry Harrison. Except squirrel soup was a staple of Garfield's home, hearty and practical. Even after he became president, friends remembered him enjoying it back at his Ohio farm, where his wife Lucretia kept the recipe alive. But if you think squirrel soup is crazy, just wait until you hear about this next president. Because Chester A. Arthur liked his food like his facial hair. Literally. Arthur was famous for those massive mutton chop sideburns, and his favorite dish, mutton chops. Although he was known for throwing lavish dinners, when it came down to it, Arthur always zeroed in on a plate of chops. Back in New York, waiters didn't even bother asking. Arthur's usual meant mutton chops with baked potatoes. The man had the best mutton chops in town, on his face and on his plate. But Grover Cleveland preferred to keep his mustache separate from his favorite food, which was pickled herring. Salty, vinegary, and very much a working man's snack. 'Cause at gatherings, Cleveland paired it with Swiss cheese and a cold beer, happily ignoring the fancy stuff on the menu. His wife Frances admitted he was at his happiest not at banquets, but in the kitchen with his herring and cheese. And next up, we got Benjamin Harrison, who loved corn. On the cob, baked into pudding, fried up as fritters, if it came from the stalk, he was eating it. Because growing up in Indiana, corn was everywhere, and he kept it rolling in the White House by serving corn chowder at state dinners. For him, corn wasn't just food. It was home, heritage, and a little bit of Hoosier pride on a plate. Meanwhile, William McKinley's go-to dish was hot lobster salad, a baked casserole of lobster and creamy sauce. Yummy! He and his wife Ida loved it so much they served it at their 25th wedding anniversary, and it quickly became a White House favorite. Restaurants picked up on it too, briefly offering lobster a la McKinley in his honor. Proof that his devotion to the dish wasn't just personal, it was presidential. On the contrary, Theodore Roosevelt was a steak man. Beef, venison, even bear. If it was meat, Teddy was eaten. French diplomats even grumbled that White House meals under Roosevelt were all steak and no elegance. But Teddy didn't care. He grilled exotic game that he hunted himself and made rules about how it should be served. Like fried chicken needed gravy soaked in, and steak had to be thick, juicy, and cooked just right. Roosevelt wasn't just president, he was basically the head chef. Which might have thickened up this next president. Because William Howard Taft didn't just eat steak and potatoes, he devoured them. So much so that he ballooned to over 300 pounds during his presidency. Because Taft famously ate a 12-ounce steak every morning for breakfast during his presidency, and sometimes for lunch and dinner too. He'd even host President's Breakfast, serving steak and eggs to senators as a way to win their support. But eventually Taft's health problems caught up with him, and the feast had to end. I'll just take those away, sir. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson had a much lighter palate. His go-to was chicken salad. With a sensitive stomach, he steered clear of spicy or heavy foods, and lunch was often just a small plate of chicken salad at his desk. He even joked that his favorite food was whatever requires the least chewing. Unlike Warren G. Harding, who stuffed himself with chicken pot pie. Because his wife Florence made it during his front porch campaign in Ohio, where supporters gathered by the thousands. So although Harding was buried in scandals, at least he could rely on some good old chicken pot pie. But speaking of pies, Calvin Coolidge was an apple pie man. Especially Vermont-style pie made with a touch of salt pork. 'Cause he often reminisced about how he never ate anything as good as his mother's pork apple pie. And he didn't save it for dessert either, enjoying it for supper, breakfast, and any time he could get his hands on it. Meanwhile, Herbert Hoover's guilty pleasure was baked sweet potatoes topped with gooey marshmallows. Whoa! He had a well-known sweet tooth, and this dish became a Depression-era favorite. Cheap, filling, and dressed up with sugar to make it feel special. Who knew Hoover had a soft and mushy side to him? Kinda like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who loved the same food as most American kids, a grilled cheese sandwich. Despite hosting kings and queens at the White House, FDR's favorite food was melted cheese on toasted bread, which he often paired with tomato soup. Because if you're popular enough to get elected president 4 times, I think you could get away with some grilled cheese without being judged. But all Harry Truman wanted was a well-done steak. No pink, ever. He once said only coyotes eat raw meat, so his steaks were always cooked through, usually with a baked potato and glass of milk on the side. Because for Truman, it wasn't about finesse, it was about meat, potatoes, and making sure nothing on the plate moved. It was just a joke, sir. Meanwhile, Dwight Eisenhower had a sweet tooth, and his favorite indulgence was Mamie's $1 Million Fudge. Loaded with chocolate, marshmallow cream, and walnuts, his wife Mamie made huge batches at Christmas. And the recipe became so popular, it was printed in newspapers and even mailed out on White House cards, becoming a 1950 sensation. So as a 5-star general, he fancied himself some 5-star fudge. But for John F. Kennedy, he was a Massachusetts boy through and through, with his favorite food being New England fish chowder, filled with creamy broth, chunks of fish, potatoes, and milk. He often had it for lunch, and when a schoolgirl once wrote asking about his favorite meal, Kennedy actually mailed back the recipe. What a sweet gesture. But unlike JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson was all about Texas barbecue and chili. At his ranch in Stonewall, he'd host world leaders with smoked brisket and ribs, a style he proudly called barbecue diplomacy. And when it came to chili, LBJ liked it extra spicy. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, published the family recipe and had the White House mail out recipe cards. Because for LBJ, barbecue and chili wasn't just a meal, it was a little Texas kick to keep him going. Hot, hot, it's too hot! I'd rather eat with Richard Nixon, who swore by a bowl of cottage cheese with ketchup. Yeah, ketchup. Whether it was breakfast on Air Force One, a quick lunch between memos, or a midnight snack during Watergate, it was always there. Even on Nixon's last day in the White House, that's what he ate. Because after he resigned, Gerald Ford stepped in and chowed down on a Sunday-style pot roast, followed by butter pecan ice cream. As a Michigan man, where meat and potatoes meals were the centerpiece of family dinners, he carried that tradition straight into the White House. And combine that with his sweet tooth, and butter pecan ice cream was stocked regularly in the presidential freezer. But with Jimmy Carter, it somehow got even simpler, because he enjoyed eating cheese grits with eggs nearly every single morning of his 100 years on this planet. Crazy. He even had a dog named Grits. The man had a full-on grits obsession. Kinda like Ronald Reagan, who was famously obsessed with jelly beans. Specifically, Jelly Belly beans, because he always had jars in cabinet meetings, on Air Force One, and even at press briefings. And for his 1981 inauguration, 3.5 tons of red, white, and blue beans were delivered. But the obsession didn't stop there, because Reagan ordered over 300,000 jelly beans per month to be distributed all around the White House. This place is starting to look like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But unlike Reagan, George H.W. Bush changed it up and ate pork rinds with a shake of Tabasco. Pork rind sales even spiked up after he praised them publicly. But of course, he also made headlines for the opposite reason, banishing broccoli from Air Force One with the line, "I am the President of the United States, and I'm not gonna eat any more broccoli." Okay, someone get this man a bag of pork rinds ASAP. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton's go-to food was a cheeseburger. More specifically, a jalapeno cheeseburger with everything on it, which made it pretty convenient for Secret Service to hit the drive-thru whenever Prez got hungry. Until Clinton got heart surgery and he had to go vegan for a while. But the one thing he admitted he missed most was a proper messy burger. But speaking of burgers, George W. Bush championed a White House invention, cheeseburger pizza. Think margarita crust topped with seasoned beef, onions, pickles, and a ketchup mustard drizzle. My beak is salivating. It became the W special for movie nights, football Sundays, and Camp David hangouts. But unlike Bush, Obama ate clean in public, until suddenly, he confessed his kryptonite was nachos, a heaping platter with cheese, guac, salsa, the works. Because March Madness watch parties in the White House Theater always feature nachos nearby. But speaking of getting food nearby, Donald Trump's favorite food is fast food. Big Macs, Quarter Pounders, KFC buckets, and plenty of Diet Coke. He once ordered 400 burgers from McDonald's to feed the 2019 NCAA football champions at the White House. That's a lot of meat. But why does Trump love fast food? Well, it's consistent, tasty, and became his fuel to return to the White House for a second time at 79 years old. But speaking of older presidents, Joe Biden's favorite treat was ice cream, especially chocolate chip. He stopped at countless parlors for double scoop waffle cones, and once stated, "My name is Joe Biden, and I love ice cream. I eat more ice cream than 3 other people you'd like to be with all at once." Hey, I guess this guy likes ice cream. But if chocolate chip ice cream sends me to bed happy, Watergate keeps me tossing and turning at night. Because this is every major presidential mistake that changed America forever. From driving natives from the South in death-filled marches, to watching the country crumble into civil war, to locking Japanese Americans behind barbed wire. US presidents made some pretty insane mistakes. So click this video right here to find out how we barely survived them. because snack time is over.